So the significance of Bristol was that it ended up usurping the Royal Africa Company because of what they would call the triangular trade. Bristol used to produce very cheap metal goods from the Avon Valley. So it would transport those goods to the west coast of Africa, primarily brass and iron, as we mentioned before, so that they could, for the use of cooking and farm implements. And so this triangular trade, how it happened was the goods would be transported to West Africa. The African kingdoms and the African paramountcies would buy them. Then from West Africa, they would now transport slaves to the Caribbean. And once they got to the Caribbean, they would now offload those slaves and sell them on. And when they were going back to Bristol, they would go back with sugar and tobacco and those kind of goods, and maybe cotton later on and stuff like that. So that was what was known as the triangular trade. And so the city of Bristol, actually in the UK, which is a western city, it's a port city, actually usurped the Royal African Company in terms of the efficacy of the slave trade. Efficacy, we can put it in such personal terms, because it was able to get these goods, these metal goods, at a much cheaper rate over to the UK. So in terms of now the slave trade in South America, as we said, it was very labor intensive. The amount of slaves that were needed in order for that enterprise to keep going in terms of sugarcane plantation and later on tobacco and cotton and such like things, meant that also because of the relatively shorter distance between the west coast of Africa and Southern America and the Caribbean, a larger amount of slaves could be transported over to South America in comparison to North America, which was a much longer journey. I think it was sometimes even 3 months. And the nature of, so we'll talk about a little bit about the nature of life in these plantations. Because I think, I can't remember exactly the life expectancy of the slaves in South America, but it was very, very short. I know, for example, for a fact in Bolivia, the black slaves that were transported over to Bolivia to work in the mines, the muleteers that they used to call them, that used to actually physically be used as mules in the Royal Mint. Their life expectancy was 2 months. So what happened was, it became much more efficacious for these slave traders to keep transporting slaves over from the west coast of Africa to South America, rather than actually raising the progeny of those slaves and to become slaves themselves. So there was a much larger preponderance and an influx of slaves in comparison to North America, which is why their life expectancies were a bit long. I think in North America it was something like 3 to 7 years. I can't remember the exact figure. Remember, this is a conversation, so you can always keep your comments coming.
Share any data you have.
Exactly. So in South America there was a much larger influx, 10 times more than in North America. Because of the distances, basically. And people thought, well, if these slaves die off, we can always get new ones. Which actually brings me on to another point. It's because of this fact, the large number of slaves that kept on being transported, that you had a constant renewal of African traditions in Southern America in comparison to North America. So you had the genesis of regions such as Candomblé in Brazil, which is a fusion of the Yoruba gods mixed with some Catholic practices and other gods from like Dahomey, Nigeria and Angola. So like the religion of Candomblé and those African practices, because of the large number of slaves that kept being transported over from West Africa, you kept on renewing African culture within the psyche of those slaves that were there. And which led to other things like this martial art in Brazil that just escapes my mind.
The one where they...
Capoeira.
Capoeira, yes.
Thank you, cameraman. Capoeira. And so Capoeira actually was a martial art that was disguised as a dance.
Wow.
So that whenever the white overlords would be coming in, they would start pretending that they were dancing when they were actually practicing their martial art for self-defense.
That's amazing.
Purposes. And the word capoeira actually comes from that vegetation that springs up from virgin forest land that has been burnt. So that is why you always had within the psyche of those South American slaves a much larger preponderance of the practices of African cultures, because there were so many more of them coming over to South America in comparison to North America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even the acceptance, I feel like the link between even the Africans of the Caribbean today to Africa, there's a lot more warmth.
Yes.
Whereas with the African American population, I think they were very isolated, and therefore you kind of feel the link is only starting to warm up.
Yeah, because there was a disconnect.
There was a disconnect,
from the culture.
From the culture, yeah. Amazing.
Yeah. So you had this. So we've talked about the slight differences in terms of North America and South America in terms of how slaves were treated. I'll go in a bit deeper on that subject. So, for example, we use Colombia. Now, what you found happening in Colombia was not as labor intensive in terms of the slaves that went to Colombia. There was much more of a cattle ranching system going on. So
paddocks.
Yes. So the severity of treatment that the slaves got was not as harsh as other plantations, like for instance in Brazil and in Argentina.
The cash crops.
Crops.
Interesting. The cash crops have been a source of quite an amount of unhappiness. And I think when we look at the colonial period, we look at things like coffee and how, coffee didn't make people significantly richer.
Yes, and it was actually...
If I look at East Africa, for example.
Yeah, coffee and tea and those kind of crops were actually much more deleterious to the soil and the quality of soil in terms of farming.
Yes.
And so that was another negative in terms of these crops that were being used to proliferate imperialist coffers, the richness for them. Another difference in terms of South America was the fact that slaves, as much as they were much more brutalized in terms of their treatment and their life expectancy was shorter, not all slaves that actually went to South America were enslaved for one reason or another. It was a very small percentage that weren't enslaved. But there was a much larger divergence of activities for those Africans who came over from Africa to South America. So some of them could be pearl divers, some of them were muleteers, some of them were blacksmiths, all under the boot of the people who took them, which were the Europeans.
Yes.
But in comparison to North America, the diversity of activities that was happening in South America, partly because of the large numbers that were going there in the first place, was much wider.
Yeah.
And
in fact, I think I read somewhere where they were saying in Jamaica at one point the ratio between white and black was 20-1. So you had actually more slaves on the island than you actually had white people.
Yeah, even in Rio de Janeiro at one point in Brazil, the ratio there was 2-1, I think.
Yeah.
So for every 2 slaves there was one white person, one Portuguese white person.
Yeah.
So there was a much wider divergence of activities in South America in comparison to North America. In South America, there was a much larger number of, for instance, like slaves were allowed to marry.
Yeah.
And the sale of slaves tended to be more, they tended to be kept within their family units. So you wouldn't just sell one person and, separate them from the families. You'd sell them as a family unit.
Yeah.
And also because of this kind of medieval system of patronage and religion, especially when it came to the Spanish and the way they colonized South America, there was that religious kind of element of you have to treat these slaves somewhat better. Not everywhere. This is only in kind of like some of the Spanish colonies.
Yes.
The French and the British did not care about that, but you had a bit more of this kind of patronage system. And in Colombia as well, you had there was redress for any slaves who felt that they were maltreated.
Yeah.
They had a right to be heard in a court of law in terms of whether they were beaten by the slave masters or any kind of inequitable treatment was happening. So there was a much wider divergence of activities and experiences in South America.
Yeah, for sure.
Having said all that, like we said before, the life expectancies in South America were much shorter.
Yeah.
Where there was brutality in South America, it was much more brutal.
Yeah.
I don't want to overstate the case. Not much more brutal, because brutality is brutality.
Yeah.
However you grade the levels of brutality. But it was much more brutal, so because of the distance between South and North. So maybe you can get a bit more specific, Edge. Like for example, Jamaica.
Yeah, so Jamaica had, you know, a high number of slaves, and the slave populations were interesting because some of them actually were shipped directly into Jamaica to work to work for the force that was there at that point, which is either the Spanish and then eventually the English. But you'll also find, interestingly, that, as I said before, you'd have slaves intended to a particular destination, but then their ships were raided and they were stolen and then brought onto the Caribbean as well. Yeah. Interesting, what I found really interesting and what I've enjoyed when I've just been looking at the history in this area is a lot of those African slaves kept their African names. And it's almost about what you're speaking to in terms of the North. Yeah. The North being isolated. I think they lost connection with Africa. The Caribbean slaves kept their African names and heritage, and they understood a lot of who they were. So for example, if you look at later on, a lot of these slaves then ran away and started forming their own free communities, the Maroons. Yes. And in that, I remember reading, there was actually one leader who kept his Akan name, his Ghanaian name of Kojo.
Kojo, yes.
Yeah, so it was very interesting for me because this really signified the fact that what you're talking about is there was always this rejuvenation of that African context with these slaves that was actually quite refreshing. So these slaves were, of course, now much more needed, especially when sugar started picking up in the 1690s, moving into the 1700s. And so the contracts were sometimes very different. It was, some were indentured actually, and then others were full-on slaves. But eventually a lot of these slaves decided to break off. And there was a percentage of them living in the mountains as free people and were actually really used to fight the wars between the European forces. So like the Kojo that I mentioned was actually aligned to the British. And there was somebody else aligned to the Spanish as the two forces were trying to fight for Jamaica, which is very interesting. And again, you also had slaves from other parts of the world like Madagascar, which you'd never really think about. But some of these slaves then were brought on to Jamaica to prolong this process of sugar farming. And not to mention later on, you had indentured labor from Asia, from India, actually coming into Jamaica as well. The other thing that I think we don't talk about is the indigenous communities of Jamaica, the Arawak Indians. And I think you shared an article with me around how Columbus had actually killed off a lot of them. But the free slaves actually intermixed and intermingled with a lot of those indigenous tribes. And so there lies in the diversity of race, I guess, in a place like Jamaica. But it was for me very interesting to see that at one point, the Maroons, with their freedom and the fact that they actually kept these British and Spanish forces off, eventually the British actually created a treaty where they said, okay, you have your freedom, you do not need to, we're not going to be playing this cat and mouse game anymore. However, when we bring slaves and they run away, your job is to catch them and bring them back to our plantations. Yes. And of course to protect us from any Dutch or Spanish or French invasion that might
that's
happen.
Actually where the word buccaneer comes from. Buccaneers, those pirates.
Imagine, because
the runaways.
Exactly.
And hidden.
And there was a lot of forced trade and pirating happening around. So this is an island that was prone to attack and take over. So the British secured themselves, actually using these very fierce, powerful military strategists called Maroons. So that was a very powerful story for me, because when you really look at slavery, it's all sadness and a lot of victim. Africans were victims, but in this particular instance, I think the joy of seeing Africans actually take power and use their strategy, their military capability to fend off slavery. So that was an interesting point for me.
Have we talked about why sugar is significant, or is all ages?
Yes. So why was sugar important? Yeah. So obviously with the spice trade and a lot of intrusions into the Asian countries, there was a lot of movement of things like tea. So the tea drinking traditions of China and India and so on had actually come onto the European states. And so I always read these old English stories, and you hear how the British traditionally drank beer and stale bread with a piece of cheese, you know. And I always think, what a miserable breakfast. But now they had tea, which obviously it's caffeine, it keeps you awake, and we have an industrial revolution happening. This is great stuff for the workers now. So, but with this tea came the need for sugar. And so sugar started building from that. And then the other thing is confectionery. You know, sweets and baking became a major part of actually complementing this tea. And using some of the spices that were also coming from the Asian continent. So then sugar became a commodity.
Very important.
And it was introduced to the common man, because before it was actually a luxury product.
Exactly, which is what I was going to mention. Sugar was actually a luxury product, but they managed to convince enough of the populace in the regions that they were selling these commodities that it was a necessity.
Exactly.
Just as the spices that they were transporting to the Far East and those kind of places were actually used to preserve the food, because keep in mind, guys, this was before anything like refrigeration was happening.
So curing was one of the main ways that you actually kept food alive.
The salts and the spices. So yeah, this is actually the reason why sugar became very important. So now, okay, after that excellent synopsis that you've given us about Jamaica and the significance of sugar, I'd also like to mention the island of Haiti. Or as it is known today, and the Dominican Republic, or as it was known then, Hispaniola and Saint Domingue. Now this is very interesting, because it is one island which, over the period of time, although originally under the rulership of the Spanish, one half, the western half, came to be ruled by the French, and the eastern half was by the Spanish. And so that was Saint Domingue and Haiti. Well, Haiti became Saint Domingue later on. Hispaniola, sorry. Hispaniola was what became Dominican Republic later on. And this is very interesting, because you can see the kind of dichotomy and the contrast between the two forms of farming and slavery that were happening in one island. So in what is now known as Haiti, which was then known as Santo Domingo or Saint Domingue, it was sugar. And sugarcane farming was very, very important.
Labor intensive.
It was very labor intensive. And at one point in the mid-1700s, Haiti was known as the Pearl of the Antilles, and it was the most lucrative colony in the world, because it accounted for almost half of the world's sugar, and 40% of France's imports, or like its export trade, was from that tiny half island of Haiti. And Haitians, over a period of time, you can see in their culture that they are very, very proud of their African roots. Whereas if you go over to the Spanish side, and what is today the Dominican Republic, or Dominica, and what was then Hispaniola, they were much more into cattle ranching. And because of the collapse of sugar farming in the Dominican Republic today, as it is known, they went into cattle ranching. Now, the styles of farming and the slavery that was happening within these two houses was markedly different, because cattle ranching, the master and slave are working side by side, just out of necessity. Whereas the division of labor between the workers in the French side, in the plantation farming, was much more marked, much more severe, much more strict. And over time, what happened in the Spanish half of the island was, because of the collapse of sugar farming there and cattle ranching, a lot of the whites actually left the island. And so what remained was those mixed race Dominicans who remained. I think they became known as the whites of the plantation. So it was much less severe in terms of the treatment of those in that side of Dominica.
And was there more intermingling with white race in the Dominican Republic?
Absolutely.
Whereas with Haiti, you might have had less of that.
There was still intermingling in Haiti, but it was much less. You're 100% correct. So, also because it was a Spanish colony in terms of Dominica, the Catholic influence was much greater. And so, the Dominicans, up to this very day, a lot of them, almost all of them actually, kind of have disregarded their African heritage, even though 90% of them are of African heritage or African descent. And they really look down on the Haitians, whereas the Haitians are much more proud of their African roots. And in Dominica, if you see somebody who is black, like you or me, and you ask them, are you black? They'll say, no, I'm Indio. Now, Indio is an indigenous term that they used for those indigenous peoples who eventually died off because of the malevolence of, you know, the slave trade and the diseases that came about. But they will not call themselves black. They will say that they're Indio.
Wow.
And so they really look down on the Haitians and the blacks, who are much more proud of their black skin.
Yes.
But this has to be looked at within the context of how the Dominicans came about, because they saw themselves as more Spanish. So like their ancestry is considered more Spanish, and there was that Catholic influence as well. So whereas in Haiti, their religion is more, it's voodoo.
Yeah.
Which comes from Central Africa.
Yeah, yeah.
And actually the Haitian Revolution, the very famous Haitian Revolution, was said to have started with a voodoo ceremony.
Wow.
Between somebody called Dati Boukman and Cecile Fatman. Actually, in the Haitian Revolution, there were 30% of fighters were women. Just as an interesting side note. So this dichotomy and the contrast between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which is actually really one island, can be seen just in stark contrast.
Wow.
That, coupled with the fact that when Haiti became independent, in 1882, they actually occupied the Dominican Republic for a period of 22 years.
Yeah.
And they imposed French as the language there, and then they also imposed a lot of taxes, particularly in the Catholic Church, for 22 years, until Dominica declared independence in 1844.
Wow.
So the racial tensions there are very stark, and it's carried on over time.
Interesting.
And so in just that one island, you can see the differences of slavery in terms of, you know, the sugarcane plantations, the cattle ranching, the Spanish influence as opposed to the French
influence.
And it carries on to this very, very day.
Wow.
I mean, even in the early 20th century, when the Americans occupied Haiti and the Dominican Republic, actually the Haiti itself only, a lot of those workers came over to work in the Dominican Republic as indentured laborers.
Yes.
And the Dominicans refused to take those jobs because they said they are not paying enough money. So they started looking down on the Haitians and said, look at these black people doing these menial jobs.
Yeah.
So very interesting. Just in one island, you can see the contrasts between the different styles
of slavery. But the Spanish were very brutal.
Yeah.
I think they had a history of brutality.
Yes.
And certainly, I think when we look at what they did to the indigenous populations themselves, I think there's a question mark, and I'm sure you're going to get to that topic of what some of the things they did in Argentina to the
Argentina is very, very interesting.
To the black population there.
Yes, Argentina is very interesting because now if you look at Argentina, I think the first slaves arrived in Argentina in 1587 in Rio del Plata. At one point in Argentina's history, I think a third of the population were actually slaves. They were actually enslaved.
That means they were black.
Which means they were black. And what happened over a period of time is that when the slaves were emancipated, in 1853, I think.
Yeah, 1830, the abolition of the slave trade, and then
and then eventually, like in 1853, the slaves were. Things actually became even worse for many of those slaves that were in Argentina because they had a policy of racial cleansing. They wanted to wipe the black off the Argentine map.
Silent genocide.
So it was systemic genocide, actually.
Systemic genocide, yeah.
You had a president called Sarmiento, I think his name was Domingo Sarmiento, whose rulership was from around the late 1860s to the early 1970s.
Yeah.
It was a short rulership, but his policy was to try and whiten Argentina completely.
Yeah.
So what happened was you had a war, like it was a trilateral partnership between Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, who were fighting against Paraguay. So what he decided to do was to man the front lines with those black ex-slaves.
So that they can die off.
So that they can die off. And he knew very well that there was a very large chance that they were not going to win that war.
Yeah.
So that, coupled with the fact that there was systemic segregation that was happening in Argentine society at the time, like in Buenos Aires and those in the bigger cities.
Serious apartheid.
Serious apartheid. Apartheid before we knew what apartheid was.
Before we knew what apartheid was, yeah.
And so the former black enslaved populations were hoarded off into the most squalid and dire conditions that you could find. And there were many constant outbreaks of yellow fever and other diseases.
And no medical assistance.
And no medical assistance at all. And so over a period of time, I think even by the end of the 1800s, they had a census in Argentina in 1895, and they didn't even bother to put down
any African ancestors.
Yeah, because they said, well, we have successfully killed these
them
people off.
That's amazing.
And the same thing happened in Brazil eventually. Like Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in 1888, in May of 1888. And subsequent to that, the subsequent Brazilian governments had a policy of whitening the population. Excuse me. So I think from the 1930s onwards, the Brazilian government at one point paid for 4 million Europeans to come and populate Brazil, because the policy itself was called braqueamento, which in Portuguese, in English, means whitening. And they had this policy of braqueamento to whiten the population because they said it would, quote, civilize Brazil.
Yeah, interesting, civilize. But you know, I have a theory, which is that I think the Spanish were full frontal to the Moor kingdom. They were populations that had experienced the black rule in a way. So perhaps also the kind of neurological, psychological connection to the fact that these blacks, who are so many, they're a third of the population, if given enough power, based on what you've seen it happening in Haiti, happening in places like Jamaica, perhaps they actually can end up being a force that's going to topple you up.
That's such a brilliant point.
So maybe that could have also been the thinking behind it, not just to make it white, but to eradicate any problems. And I think they were also looking at North America and looking at how slaves are running away, they're agitating for their freedom.
The Maroons.
So really just kill them off. I think that's what they figured.
You had these regions in Brazil also called quilombos, which were like kind of enclaves for freed slaves. Actually there was a lot of quilombos that were actually encircled the city of Rio de Janeiro. But that is such a brilliant point, because as we keep saying, we have to keep in mind the context of the historical times. So we were not so far removed.
And the psychology, the root in terms of the way we think and know and experience blacks as Spanish people. You know.
So I think it's important to remember that we were not too far removed from the period when the Moors really ruled the world, ruled the seas.
Yeah, exactly.
So this was probably still in the psyche of those the Spanish imperialists. Brilliant point, and a very, very important point to mention. So we've seen, now we have touched upon South America.
We've touched upon South America, the Caribbean,
Haiti.
We haven't really looked at North America and the kind of slavery. I think we haven't really double-clicked into that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, North America, in terms of popular culture and in terms of the slave trade, is probably the best known. I think this is why we really wanted to start with South America and to show the contrasts. In contrast to South America, North America actually only received about 6% of Africans in terms of the total number of slaves that were transported on. And in North America, cotton was the main cash crop. Yeah. And as we have said before, because of the logistics of the travel in terms of the slave trade, the numbers were far fewer.
Yeah, than in South America and Caribbean.
Doesn't make it any less significant, but it was far fewer in terms of the number of slaves that were actually being transported over. North America is very interesting because in our collective consciousness and psyche, we always associate the slave trade with the South.
Yes.
So we have this North versus South dichotomy, which eventually leads to a big civil war in the States between 1860 and 1865.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, the first slave ship that was ever built was built in Massachusetts, which was built in the North.
To the North, yeah.
And by the time the first Africans arrived in North America in 1619, 500,000 slaves had already been transported to Brazil. The slave trade. Now, in North America, like I said, it's very big in popular culture. We've had movies like Amistad, Give Us Free, and all these kind of things that, they kind of try and set a different kind of narrative to us.
Yeah.
Which is, yes, slavery was bad, but hey, we had these benevolent, abolitionists that tried to help the condition of the blacks. And without them, they could not have emancipated themselves from their dire conditions. People like John Adams and John Quincy Adams. But the fact of the matter is, in North America, 40 of the 56 signatories to the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders. Cotton was a massive thing. They needed that in terms of a cash crop. I think by 1840, 59% of exports coming from North America were due to cotton.
Yep.
Mississippi, if you took Mississippi itself, or the Mississippi Valley as a region, which is Mississippi, Tennessee, and Louisiana, if you took that region alone, it would have been the 4th largest economy in the world.